We are online.
Thank you very much. Can we have Elena as the main picture? Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena, for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for your presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. To people listening, I would like to start with introducing very briefly Elena, who is Associate Professor of History at Concordia University in Montreal. She's the author of The Listener's Voice, Early Radio and the American Public, and co-editor of Radical Histories in Digital Culture, an issue of the Radical History Review that was published in 2013. And she has published widely on the radio and on translation as well. Thank you very much. Today is a presentation that has been organized by the HESCALE network. And I would like to thank Maxime Bristel, Simona Gimonet, Nicolas Gut, and Sam Dancer for making this presentation possible and this conversation as well. So thank you very much for being with us. There are various questions I've got in relation to your presentation. And the first thing I would like to ask you is, how did you come to do research on translation?
Well, my family were actually translators. So I originally was a historian of the United States, of radio, and I had a friend who was doing a volume on sound in Soviet cinema, and she asked me to write something. And I said, well, I can interview my father and my grandmother and my aunts because they were translators in the 60s and 70s, and they translated film live. And she's a film scholar. Her name is Masha Salaskina, and she's like, well, really? I don't remember that being a big issue. And so she said, yes, you can do an article. So I did an article, and I interviewed them and their friends. And there were about 40 people who were doing it regularly. And some people who were students in language institutions also did that while they were in school, just to earn some money. And it turned out that it is an art form. It was considered an art form in the 60s and 70s by practitioners. And it was really hard to do. And it was done throughout the Soviet Union. So it's not just in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Tashkent, where festivals were quite common. It was also traveled even to Siberia, but definitely to capital cities in other republics, such as Kiev, Baku, Yerevan, Tbilisi. So yeah, so that's how I started writing about this, and then I just keep finding new stuff. There's lots in the archives as well.
Okay, and that was when another question I had. How do you do research on translation? You're talking about archives. How much is kept about this heritage? I mean, you're talking about practitioners, but and of it being an art form as well, which is not usually thought of as such. So how do you do research on translation?
Well, there is a little bit on dubbing, and there's a lot of work on dubbing of films in the Soviet Union. There are a couple of people who work in it. There's a book about to come out about Soviet Union and its opening to foreign countries in 50s and 60s that will have a chapter on translation by Eleanor Gilbert, a professor at the University of Chicago. But she's working mostly on European countries, and there's actually not as much done on Africa and Asia and the Arab countries. There's a lot of information. There are funds in Rugali. This is a Russian archive for literature and arts. Several archives. There are private archives of filmmakers, but there's also the Ministry of Cinema. Great archives, and I only gave you in my presentation, I only showed maybe 1% of what's available. There's material on visits from foreign countries, including Arab countries and African countries, material on education in geek of foreign filmmakers, usually from countries unaligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. So there's lots to research. And then in another archive, GARF, Government Archive of the Russian Federation, which is the main state archive, there are papers of organizations that were friendship organizations between with different countries, including, so there would be friendship with Tunisia, friendship with Morocco, and friendship with African countries in general. So those papers also contain correspondence with filmmakers and some information on translation. But translation itself is very hard to research because there are very few reports. So the few reports that I have are from people who are still alive, and also from these other translator reports. One of this I cited for 1964. So the visit from Egypt in 1964, I know about it from a translator's reports, and these translators were trained by the KGB to basically spy on visiting filmmakers. And then they wrote reports about what happened. And some information in these reports is about the distribution of films that these visitors brought to the Soviet Union, including translation issues.
Okay.
As well, there are, yes, just one thing. There are also reports, general reports from film festivals, and these reports sometimes contain information about translation as well.
All right. I mean, what you describe in your presentation is a very artisanal process of translation in which you have a certain amount of works that translators have to do based on how much initial material they get, right? Whether they get pre-transcribed dialogues or not, whether there are subtitles or not, so there are various issues that are associated with your presentation. And the first for me is, how were translators trained and recruited? Because, I mean, there is also a whole political project that's associated with translating films at festivals, which is the main focus of your presentation. So how were translators trained and how were they recruited?
Well, usually the translators were students in language universities. They were recruited mostly by organizers of the festivals. There was a head of translation, film translation at the festival, who recruited people. It was really hard to do because, for example, after the first Moscow Film Festival, most translators didn't return to the second Moscow Film Festival because they weren't paid. Others found the work too hard. Even if you knew the language, it was really stressful to translate when you weren't sure whether subtitles would be there or the dialogue list would be there, or if you were translated live. Even if you had really good quality language knowledge, you still needed to be really quick on your feet. And a lot of people who were excellent translators on paper, they couldn't really do it live when the movie was going on. And there's also difference between translators from European languages and translators from languages such as Arabic, for example, or Hindu or Farsi, Persian, because there were many people who knew French or English fairly well. French, English, and Italian there were many takers. So in that sphere, a lot of people who started as translators were actually doing something else before. So one of the most well-known Polish translators actually was a physics student. Another one was a student in geography, I think. So they weren't even humanities students, but they knew the language because their parents spoke it or because their parents traveled. One of my aunts started when she was 16. She was still in high school when she started translating, but she knew French really well. So in these common languages, a lot of people found it just as a way of earning money because the pay was really good. But in Arabic or Persian, most people who became professional translators were actually were also scholars of the language. Mikhailov, for example, Alexei Mikhailov, he's a very famous translator from Persian. He also translated for Brezhnev, for example. So he was a political, a translator in politics and diplomacy, as well as in films. But he was way better in films. Like nobody could replace him as a film translator, but there are plenty of takers to translate from for Brezhnev. And then Naumkin, whom I cite in my paper, he is another example. He's an eminent scholar of Egypt, and actually received a medal from Egyptian government for promoting Egyptian culture in the Soviet Union. But at the time, he was a student. He was just doing it to earn some money because he was in school and he needed to buy clothes and books.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that's actually quite interesting to see the variety of people who just happen to be at the right place at the right time, in the right place at the right time.
Exactly.
All right, you say that. I mean, to a certain extent, you say that Russian audiences, enjoyed Egyptian melodramas. However, it seems to me that in festivals, films could be melodramas, but they were also very different films, and some of them had a very different content because the political content was also important.
Yes.
However, because of translation issues and sometimes the lack of material, there is a difference between the initial content of the film and what got translated.
Yes.
And then based on that, were there, in relation to translation, were there limits that couldn't be transgressed, either in terms of political content, either in terms, in sexual innuendos or certain limits that were, and how were translators, probably, were they given strict guidelines, or basically was it part of the culture that everyone knew should not be transgressed?
Well, I think on one hand there were rules. They were supposed to be prepared to translate correctly, and especially for films in competition, there was supposed to be dialogue lists, but clearly they were not. I have many other examples, in addition to the one that I gave in the paper, that people were often left without any kind of translation aids, so they had to make up or they had to kind of translate on the fly. In theory, they were supposed to translate everything correctly, but clearly they would insert their own interpretation often into the translations. So I cannot say that there were that many films that were translated perfectly. So definitely there was some misunderstanding between the audience and what the film wanted to say. However, there was still a lot of enthusiasm for these films. So people just wanted to see foreign films. They haven't seen that many. It just the Soviet Union just opened up. Anything that had a different context was interesting. In Tashkent, especially because the film was created to promote radical cinema of non-aligned countries. There were a lot of political films, and in some cases, people just walked out of the theater because they didn't want like a straight political film, but in other cases they enjoyed it because there was some drama in it. Or usually people would not, I cannot say that political films were liked for their politics. Like, it's not like people go to the theater and they really want to film about liberation of Algiers, but they appreciated the plot of it. Like, the Battle of Algiers was shown in the Soviet Union, and it was well received. There were films. Actually, that's not true. There were a certain strata of society that really appreciated political films, who went to learn more about liberation movements. But mostly that was probably most likely to happen during film festivals in Moscow rather than in Tashkent, which is paradoxical because most filmmakers actually debated these issues in Tashkent amongst themselves. But there was a lot of enthusiasm for films, not just because of their content. Like, people enjoyed misunderstanding as well, and these play of words were interesting for them also. So they kind of judged the translators on their own merits, and then the film on its own merit as well.
So would you describe the translation as performance?
Yes. I think that's how people perceived it during film festivals, how the audiences perceived it, because people clapped, often clapped after a good translation. And they often, in Moscow at least, I know that audiences knew translators by name. So they would go, they would ask when they came to see a film, especially if it was a comedy of any kind, because it's really hard to translate language that are jokes. They would ask who is the translator to know for sure that, like, if the translator they liked would be at the next screening, maybe they would go to the next screening. But usually it's the same person who translated the entire day. So they were just happy to be with a good person.
Okay. So to a certain extent, my next question had to do with the context in which the translation took place, because visibly there were very eager audiences. And then the fact that it was not quite adequately translated was not an issue.
No, I don't think so. Because also filmmakers were there. It was a major event in any case.
Okay, so there was a show beyond the very precise content of the dialogues. Mm-hmm. And were there cases of conflicts? Do you know of conflicts happening? I mean, in which someone might have known the actual dialogue and the translation was a misrepresentation, or?
That's a good question. I don't know any examples of like films from the Middle East or North Africa, but I do know there was a case of a Japanese film being translated during the Moscow Film Festival, and the translator was called away, who actually knew Japanese, and a person who ended up translating was a researcher at this theater, the Illusion Theater, and he didn't know Japanese at all. But the room was full and people wanted the film. And he saw the film before, so he knew the story, but he didn't understand a word in it. So he just made up every single line. But he was really good. He was very entertaining. So people laughed and they really liked it. But after there was one member in the audience who actually knew Japanese, and he came in to complain. He said, well, you just got everything wrong. And then he said, and then during the discussion, it turned out that he still enjoyed the film, even though the lines were wrong, because he conveyed the translator conveyed the main idea really well. So even with complaints, people appreciated the effort or the artistry. But definitely with the bad translators, there would be angry people. And in melodramas, for example, sometimes because the translators were educated, people university educated and well-read, and they were also snobs a little bit, so they didn't like melodramas as a genre, whereas the audience really liked melodramas. So sometimes the translators would make fun of the film or be totally bored by it and not show the emotion the way the audience wanted. And after that, there were definitely clashes and complaints, for sure.
Were there ever translators that were totally banned? And what were the reasons why they were
That's a good question.
ban?
I think certain translators were not given opportunities to translate at official functions. So, for example, obscenity was not supposed to be translated, like any kind of swear words were off limits, but certain translators enjoyed translating directly. So it was more correct to translate directly rather than make up euphemisms. So my father, for example, he translated directly, and he wasn't allowed. After a while, he was just banned from translating films for officials because he would just translate correctly all the time. Yeah, and then once he was forbidden to do that, and he just added every time he had to come up with a euphemism, he added it's much stronger in the original. So the audience laughed at that, which also wasn't a good thing at an official function, because it ruined the seriousness of the film or the seriousness of the event.
Okay. And you alluded to the fact that translating at one edition, they were not paid at all, but then it could be extremely well paid as well. So,
well, they were supposed to be paid in 1959. I don't know what happened. Like the only thing I know I have is this report that says that most translators just didn't come back. Most of the time, by the mid 60s, when I still have people who talk about being translators, they were paid extremely well. They were paid on the level of young professional. So the salary, like they could earn during the month more or the same or more as a person working in a research institute, just a beginner, like a first level professor or a white collar worker. And that kind of money, in addition to whatever else that we're doing in their more traditional lives, was really helpful. And you could, for example, save up. You could work maybe for 3 or 4 months and then not work for a while, or do 2 festivals and a few trips in the country, and then you would be set for a year and you wouldn't have to work. You could write novels or, I don't know, make music, for example.
Wow, that's quite a lot. You alluded to the fact that there were a few, mostly Egyptian films that were distributed commercially, and these films were dubbed.
Yes.
Do you know? Do you have any information about who did the dubbing, how, and what kind of process it went through?
I haven't researched that because my my focus is on live translation, but there's that information is definitely available. The film studio that would do it would be the Gorky studio. It's like a studio for children's films usually, but also did most of the dubbing in the Soviet Union. The one thing to remember is that often the music was, like, early on in the 50s and 60s, music was translated as well. So if you wanted to hear conventional, like the original music, you had to come see the film at the festival. And then once it comes into general distribution and it's officially dubbed, a lot of songs were redone in Russian. So you wouldn't get like the Egyptian song and dance, you will get the Russian song and dance. And for White Dress, the song was redone actually by Russian orchestra or performers.
Okay, which explains why translators may have been a preferred alternative in some ways.
Yes, although I think people enjoyed dubbed films as well. And I do have, like, from the 50s, I have some letters from audiences that say we prefer dubbed cinema because it's easier to hear and it's several voices rather than one voice. So they prefer dubbing to subtitles and to one voice translating. But they could only get these interesting films with the live translator. So after a while, I guess they got used to it. I don't know exactly when that happened, when translator became an interesting thing to do, like to see a film with a translator became its own attraction. But definitely it wasn't the case in the 50s, and definitely by the late 60s, it was already. very popular. So some place in between, people learned that learn to appreciate that kind of translation as well. I think it also because these professionals became good at it. So there were people that you could see who had their own art to share, who were translators.
Okay. I had another question. You alluded to the fact that Tashkent had become a meeting place for filmmakers. And people enjoyed coming to Tashkent, and they enjoyed coming to Tashkent more. I mean, they were paid first to come to Tashkent, unlike when they had the possibility to go to Carthage. That's the understanding I got.
Yes.
And so one of my questions had to do with the fact that it became a place for Arab filmmakers to meet and a place to select films that could circulate in the Arab world afterwards.
Well, I definitely have evidence of that. My evidence of Arab cinema circulation is basically from articles, reports on the festival, and also from yeah, I think these are most, and also from statements to the press by Arab filmmakers who visited, and by a few, I met a few Arab filmmakers who studied at GIC. So that's another really good source if anybody wants to study it. Gabrielle Chomentowski, a researcher, she specializes in education of Arab and African filmmakers in the Soviet Union, and she did a lot of research on that. And through her, I went to this conference where I met filmmakers from Syria and Morocco and Sudan who told me that they all went to Tashkent. So I don't think, I think for a filmmaker who was already established, they would definitely go to Carthage. I'm not saying that Tashkent was in any way on the same level for Arab filmmakers. And Cannes, of course, was a lot more prestigious to get prizes, and Ouagadougou was excellent for sub-Saharan Africa. But if you were a filmmaker who was not known and you didn't have any money, and maybe your film was just a student film, then, of course, Tashkent was the first place where you would meet people who would then maybe invite and pay for you to go to Carthage or Ouagadougou. There is some evidence that from Russian books that Arab filmmakers got together at Tashkent film festivals and organized, planned association meetings or different reunions elsewhere. But unfortunately, I only know it from the Russian book, and I don't really trust. It's hard to know how serious this meeting was, whether it was organized by Soviets, and then Arab filmmakers just came and pretended to discuss something serious, or they really did have their own meetings where they decided on how Arab cinema was going to progress further, also at Carthage and other places. I'd like to believe that, and I'm looking for more evidence. Definitely, I have a report about Osman Simben, a Senegalese filmmaker who went to Moscow Film Festival in '67, and he spent most of his time planning organizations and meetings among African filmmakers. So he didn't really care as much about meeting the Soviets or Europeans. Like, he really had a plan, and he met with filmmakers from Ghana and Mali. And because it's before 1969, when Ouagadougou was founded, and he was part of the founding of Ouagadougou, and then he was also co-founder of FESPACI, the filmmaker, the African filmmaker organization, also in 1969. I'd like to believe that some of that pre-organizing happened in '67 at Moscow, but the evidence is slim, obviously, but I would like to find more.
Okay. Would you have anything to add about the idea of translating as an art form? What kind of qualities does it require? What kind of relation? I mean, was it based on a good knowledge of a sense of film, or a sense of what kind of skills did it require?
Well, it's great to know the language. There were several types of translators. Some really well knew the language, and they took care to try to either translate the same film several times to practice delivery, so they would learn precisely how to convey what happened in the film, or they would study, say, certain filmmakers. So even if they saw the film for the first time from a certain filmmaker, they would know his other work or her other work, and they would be able to guess what's coming next. There was an interview that kind of argued that if you really like the filmmaker, even his new picture, you will know what the next scene is, because you will be so much in tune with his art. So that was another way to approach it. Then the other genre of filmmakers would be those like Kushnirovich, who translated this Japanese film. They didn't really care about what the original was. They just wanted to entertain the listener, the viewers. So they would make up. And making up something on the fly was also really important, because even if you don't understand, very often there would be phrases that are not heard very well by the translator, and if it was in important screening, you couldn't be silent. You had to say something. So it was important to be able to say something useful in this time that went together with the rest of the film. And sometimes there were these tricks that translators did in order to not make a mistake. So if they didn't hear something and it seemed like they were talking, like especially in detective films, when there was a murder at some point, it was really important to hear what was happening, because you can't say, if you heard that something happened to a particular person, but you don't know what, you can't say, oh, this person was murdered, because in the next scene, that very person may be coming into the room and having, I don't know, coffee. So you had to be vague enough so the person could be either dead or alive and coming into the next scene. And that was also an art. You had to kind of fudge, understand the film in general, and be vague enough but also direct enough that people could follow the plot. And then the virtuosos, like the Grigory Libergal, whom I cited, they would do both. So they would be they would have great knowledge of the language, and they would have a lot of practice, but also they would be able to do this extemporaneous translating on the fly if necessary. And also you had to, it's physically was a grueling work. People lost several pounds in a day, because at film festivals you would translate 3 or 4 screenings a day, either one film or 2 or 3 films, which was even more difficult. And you had to stay on your feet, and you couldn't be tired, and sometimes you couldn't eat. So it was really difficult, and you had to be in a good form to do it.
Yeah, you needed both physical and mental presence.
Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you very much. That was really, is there anything you'd like to add about simultaneous translation as an art form, as a political issue? Oh, it looks...
the one thing, yeah. What?
No, I thought we had lost you for a minute, because you disappeared from the screen.
Yeah, I got a message on my screen. So the only thing I would like to add, if you know of anybody who is also working on this, it's interesting that the Iranian talk before this was also in part on live translation, the early period in Iranian cinema. And I really would like to get people together who are working on this, because this practice existed in everywhere, but differently in different regions of the world. So it would be great to have some sort of conference or just get together and compare notes on this research. Yes.
Hey, that would be an idea. That might be a future project. There are more and more, I mean, there are very few, but more and more people interested in issues of translation and dubbing. And there is Nolwenn Mangan, who was part of the organization initially, is organizing a conference, but it's on the more industrial approach. But there may be connections that, I mean, and that are possible. So definitely. And you mentioned as well, Gabrielle Chomatowski's work. I'm not sure I got her last name wrong, but we know of her work, and we have read articles that she has published on these issues. So definitely, yes. And she has been associated with some activities of our network.
Oh,
so
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. That is a pleasure. And I hope our paths will cross again at some point on some of these work.
Are you coming to the conference in Montreal this month in April?
No. I will be, my colleague, Claude Forest, will be going. I will be going to Hujda. So,
okay, but yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon. But I'm planning to go to the one that to the conference in Montreal as well. And I know it will be French, but I will attend.
Very good. I'm very happy. And I wish I could. Frankly, I really wish I could. But funding is an issue. But
I understand.
I'm sure it's going to be a great conference. Thank you very much, Elena, for your contribution. And I'm sure we'll see each other at some other seminars or meetings.
Okay, sounds
Bye-bye.
good. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the IUT Robert Schuman for making this seminar possible. And once again, thank you to Maxime, Sam, Samantha, and Nicholas for being here with us. And mainly also as it is a long weekend in Alsace. We've got 4 days off and we had to keep them for longer. So thank you to them all. Bye-bye. Thank you. Donc, on est hors ligne.